There is a specific moment in your life when everything starts to feel strange. It's not something you can clearly point to. There isn't an exact event. There isn't a specific day when everything changed. But still, you feel it, as if you were living the same life, but with a different feeling inside. As if something had shifted. Even though nothing actually moved, nothing breaks in an obvious way, but nothing fits like it used to either. And that's the most unsettling part. There's no logical reason. There's no obvious explanation, but there is a constant feeling of misalignment. And if you don't understand this now, you can interpret it completely wrong. You might think you're lost, that you're unmotivated, that you're drifting away from everything, when in reality, you are leveling up. And leveling up never starts with clarity. It starts with discomfort, because what you're feeling is not confusion. It's a clear sign that your old reality no longer fits you. It's like trying to fit into something that once worked, but now has become too small. But almost no one realizes this in time. And because they don't, they react the wrong way. They insist, they force, they try to recover what no longer fits. They try to go back to what no longer makes sense. And in doing so, they end up delaying exactly what has already begun. Because the change hasn't stopped, it just meets resistance. If you stay until the end, you will understand exactly what phase you're in. And why everything feels misaligned before it finally reorganizes. Because there is an order to this process. And when you understand that order, you stop fighting against it and start walking with it. Because everything begins in a silent way, without warning, without announcement, without external validation, a discomfort with no logical explanation. You look at your routine and something feels off. It's not big, it's not dramatic, it's subtle, but constant. The same people, the same places, the same conversations. But inside you, it's no longer the same. And that confuses you, because externally, nothing has changed. But internally, everything has already started. And when the internal changes first, the external takes a little time to catch up. And that gap is where most people get lost, because they don't understand what's happening. Your consciousness has advanced, but your reality hasn't caught up yet. And that is exactly what creates this discomfort. That feeling of being between two places, no longer fully who you were, but not yet living what you are becoming. And that's exhausting, because it feels unstable, it feels undefined. But it's not a mistake, it's adjustment, it's recalibration. But when you try to ignore this, when you try to fit again into what no longer makes sense, when you try to act like before, just to maintain a false stability, the discomfort increases. And it increases because you are going against something that has already started within you. You are trying to remain where you no longer fit, and that generates where? Internal and external. And then, without you realizing, something else starts to happen. You lose the ability to live on autopilot. What used to be natural now gets stuck. It no longer flows the same way. Old habits no longer fit. What you used to do without thinking now feels strange. Impulsive reactions lose strength, and in their place, something new appears. A space, an interval between what happens and how you respond. You begin to notice before you act. And that completely changes the game, because now you no longer react just out of pattern. You observe, you feel, you question, and that is active consciousness. But this level of awareness at first is uncomfortable, because autopilot was easier, faster, more comfortable. Now there is responsibility, there is choice, there is perception, but this is exactly where your reality starts to be recreated, not out there, in here, in this space. Either you go back to autopilot and repeat the past, or you sustain this awareness, even with discomfort, and change what comes next. And while this is happening inside you, outside also begins to respond, even if subtly at first, without conflict, without explanation, without major events, just a natural distancing. People no longer make sense. Conversations feel draining. Environments feel heavy. And you start to want something you may not have valued before. Silence, space, distance, time with yourself. And this can feel like loss. It may seem like you are isolating yourself. But that's not what's happening. It's not loss. It's repositioning. It's frequency adjustment. Not everyone can remain on the same wavelength as you when you change internally. And the more you try to hold on to misaligned connections, just out of habit, history, fear, the more you wear yourself out because you feel it and you can no longer ignore it. But at the same time, something inside you starts to become more sensitive, more attentive, more perceptive. You begin to notice things you completely ignored before. Small signs become clear. Details gain meaning. Intuition appears before thought. You feel what is right before you can explain it. And this shakes the mind because the mind was trained to control, to understand everything, to be certain. But now it starts to lose space and awareness begins to take over. And the more you try to control, the more confused you become. The more you try to force logic, the further you get from clarity. But the more you trust what you feel, the more everything begins to align, even without immediate explanation, even without guarantees. But this process doesn't come lightly. It comes intensely because it moves everything. Emotions intensify, fluctuations appear. Days when you feel good, light, aligned, and days when everything feels heavy, confusing, slow. And the first reaction is to think something is wrong, that you're regressing, that you lost control, but you're not. This is release. This is internal reorganization. It's everything that was accumulated, being processed. You are not regressing. You are clearing. And feeling in this moment is not weakness. It's part of the change. It's part of the transition. It's part of the realignment. And this is what leads you to a point you can no longer avoid. New possibilities emerge. Opportunities appear outside the old pattern. Paths you never considered begin to make sense. You start to see what you couldn't before. Because it's not reality that changed first. It was your perception. And when perception changes, reality follows. But there is one point here that defines everything. Because it's not about accessing this state. It's about sustaining it. Because even after all this, the old still tries to come back. Old thoughts, old patterns, old doubts. And this is where most people retreat. Because they don't sustain the new. Transformation does not happen the moment you understand. Because understanding is just the beginning. Understanding is a click, a moment of clarity, but transformation is construction, it's repetition, it's sustained decision even when emotion changes. It happens when you maintain. You maintain when it's easy and especially when it's not. You maintain when everything feels aligned and also when everything feels confusing again. Because anyone can maintain when they feel certain, but few can maintain when doubt appears. And that is exactly where transformation is defined. When you choose every day, consciously, not to return to who you already stopped being, even if it feels more comfortable, even if it brings temporary relief, even if no one sees the difference, because this choice is almost always silent. No one applauds, no one validates, but it is shaping everything. Every time you choose not to go back, you strengthen the new version. Every time you give in, you feed the old one. And this game happens all the time, in the details, until a point comes, not immediate, but inevitable. The new stops being effort. It stops requiring constant attention. It stops feeling like something you have to sustain all the time. And it begins to become natural, automatic, but at a new level. You no longer need to think so much. You no longer need to convince yourself. You simply act differently. Because you already are different. And when that happens, your reality can no longer remain the same. because now it's not something you try to access. It's something you sustain effortlessly. Now tell me honestly, are you still trying to go back to who you were just because it was easier, or have you already realized you no longer fit there, even if there's still attachment? Because there is a huge difference between missing something and wanting to go back. And many people confuse that. If this made sense to you, comment, I am in change, but comment with awareness, not as momentary motivation, comment as a decision. And if you're going through this, stay here, because what's happening to you is not random. There is a process, there is a pattern, and you are inside it. And if you're still here, you've already realized that this is not just about understanding. It never was. It's about recognizing it within yourself. It's about stopping the denial of what is already evident inside you, because there is one detail almost no one talks about, and it defines everything. It defines whether you move forward or not go back all over again. Your mind still tries to negotiate with the past, and it does this subtly. It doesn't come saying, go back. It comes with justifications, with selective memories, with arguments that seem rational, even after everything you felt, realized, understood in silence. There is still a part of you trying to pull you back, not because it's the best path, but because it's the most familiar. And the brain always prefers the familiar, even if it's limiting, because it associates familiar with safety. It seeks predictability. It seeks control. It seeks what? Even if it no longer works, at least you know how to deal with. And this is deeper than it seems, because it's not just about habits. It's not just about routine. It's about identity. It's about who you were for a long time. It's a version of you trying to survive. A version built over years, based on experiences, on repeated patterns, on adaptations you made to fit in, on ways of thinking you learned without realizing. And now, that version feels like it's losing space. And everything that feels like it's losing space reacts. That's why it resists. That's why it tries to convince you. That's why it creates doubt, confusion, a false nostalgia for things you already know. Clearly, no longer serve you. And this is where most people get lost, because they don't recognize it. They confuse this impulse with intuition. They think it's a sign to go back, but it's not. It's attachment to the familiar. It's resistance to expansion. And this is the real internal battle. Not visible, not dramatic, but constant, silent, and decisive. On one side, who you used to be, with everything that was comfortable, even if limited. On the other, who you are becoming, more conscious, more aligned, but still under construction, still without all the answers. And that creates insecurity. And this is the most important point. The problem is not feeling this division. That's inevitable. If you are evolving, you will feel it. The problem is always obeying the old side, just because it screams louder. Because it does scream louder. It comes with urgency, with pressure, with arguments that seem logical, with fear disguised as caution. And if you don't recognize this, you give in. And every time you give in, something happens. Silent, but very serious. You weaken your own awareness. You break trust in yourself. You begin to doubt what you had already clearly perceived. And little by little, you disconnect from yourself. And this creates a dangerous effect. A cycle of internal doubt where you no longer know whether to trust what you feel or what you fear. And this cycle keeps many people stuck. Even after awakening, internal doubt, that feeling of not knowing who to trust anymore, not even yourself. And little by little, without noticing, you return to patterns you had already overcome. Not because you want to, but because you didn't sustain. Now, when you do the opposite, everything changes. When you sustain, even with discomfort, even with uncertainty, even without immediate guarantee, something starts to strengthen inside you. And it's not external, it's internal, real confidence. clarity that doesn't depend on validation, direction that doesn't need to be explained to anyone. And that changes how you position yourself in life. You stop negotiating with what no longer makes sense. You stop going back. You stop abandoning yourself just to feel safe. And this is where things start to reorganize in a different way. Not perfect, but aligned. You begin to realize you no longer need to chase like before, nor insist where there is no response, nor prove your worth all the time. Because when you align, what is yours begins to respond differently, with more flow, with more precision, with less wear. But this requires something few people are truly willing to do, to remain. And remaining is not passive waiting. It is sustaining internally, even when the external hasn't caught up yet, even without validation, even when no one understands what you are living, even when it seems like nothing has changed on the outside, because it is exactly in this invisible period that everything is being adjusted. This is where reality begins to reorganize, based on what you are sustaining inside. But because it's not visible, many people give up. They go back. They interrupt the process halfway. And then they say they tried, but it didn't work. But it's not that it didn't work. It wasn't sustained. Now, do you understand why so many people start, but almost no one reaches the end? Because starting is easy when you feel. The hard part is sustaining when you don't see. And you are not here by accident. If you got this far, if this makes sense, it's because this is already happening inside you. Even if you're still trying to explain it, even if there is still doubt sometimes, you have already perceived it. And once you perceive, you can no longer go back to being completely who you were. You can try, but it won't fit anymore. Now, the only real choice you have is simple, but decisive. Either you evolve consciously, or you resist and prolong the process. But in both cases, the change has already begun. So pay attention to this. You are not late. You are not lost. And you are definitely not alone in this process. There is an adjustment happening. And the more you stop fighting it, the faster it organizes. Now I want to know from you, which part of this process are you in? Are you still in the discomfort? Or have you already started to notice the changes happening? Write it down below. And if you understood this and know you are going through this phase, subscribe. Because this is not common content. This is for those who have already realized they are no longer the same person and can no longer live as before. And there's one more thing you need to face with maturity. Not everything leaving your life will come back. And this is not punishment. It's direction. Because when you change frequency, you change access. And trying to recover everything from the past, just because it once made sense, is what keeps many people stuck. You were not called to repeat. You were called to move forward, and moving forward requires space. Internal space and external space. That's why this emptiness that sometimes appears is not lack. It is preparation. It is ground being cleared before something new occupies it. But the mind interprets this emptiness as absence, as loss, as something wrong, and tries to fill it quickly with anything. Any distraction, any connection, any decision that relieves immediate discomfort. And this is where many people sabotage their own process, because they trade construction for relief. They trade evolution for escape. But if you sustain this space without rushing, something much more aligned begins to emerge, not forced, not artificial, natural. And you begin to notice a clear difference. What comes now doesn't weigh you down. It doesn't confuse you. It doesn't require you to shrink yourself, because it is aligned with who you have become. And this completely changes the type of reality you begin to live. But along with this comes greater responsibility, because now you know, you perceive, you feel, and you can no longer pretend you don't understand. Ignoring after awakening weighs more than ever, because you know what you're doing. And that requires positioning. More conscious choices, stronger cuts, clearer direction. And yes, it's scary because you can no longer outsource your life. But at the same time, it is liberating because you stop living on autopilot and start living with intention. And this is where the real shift happens. when you stop waiting for something external to change and assume that your internal state defines everything. Thought, emotion, frequency, decision, everything starts within. And when that aligns, the external has no choice but to respond. It may not be immediate, but it is inevitable, because you cannot sustain a new identity and keep living the same reality for long. At some point, it gives in. Now, pay attention to this. You don't need to understand everything. You need to sustain what you already understood, even if there is still doubt, even if you still fluctuate, even if there are still hard days, because consistency is not perfection, it is continuity. And the more you continue, the stronger this becomes, until a point comes when you realize something simple, but definitive. You changed, and it wasn't from outside in, it was from inside out, and no one can take that away. Now tell me, are you going to keep resisting what has already begun, or will you finally embrace this change? If you made it this far, comment "I sustain" and share this with someone who is also going through this process but hasn't understood it yet. And if you want to keep strengthening this awareness, subscribe. Because from here on, it's no longer about going back, it's about becoming